Welcome to another edition of the Pace Report. I'm Brian Pace, reporting live here at Smalls here in New York City. Blessing the band stage in the grand reopening of Phase 5 here at Smalls Jazz Club is the legendary flautist and tenor saxophonist Lew Tabackin. Now, Lew has been a stalwart of the jazz game for well over 60 years, and he's played with the likes of Shelly Manne, Billy Higgins, as well as Clark Terry, just to name the endless few. Tonight, you're going to witness him playing some flute as well as tenor saxophone, as well as tonight we're going to sit down and break bread and talk about his very, very loyal and deep Philadelphia roots. As you might know, Philadelphia has produced some of the most important jazz musicians in the world, ranging from John Coltrane to the great Benny Golson to the Brecker brothers, just to name the endless few. Also, we're going to sit down and break bread and talk about how he developed a language for both the flute that is completely different from how he plays the tenor saxophone. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the sounds of the legendary Lew Tabackin. Congratulations. This is the first live performance that Smalls has opened since the pandemic. And how are you and your wife doing? How are you guys handling this pandemic for the last 6 months?
Well, I'm doing the best I can. My last actual gig was March the 14th. Since then, I've only had 2 streams here and 1 stream in Baltimore. And that's not a lot. The main thing is it's hard to keep your chops happening and keep your, breathing happening, all the little technical stuff. But doing the best I can. Guys come over to my house every so often and play in my basement. So that really helps me.
I want to start this interview off by 2 things. You are proficient on the flute as well as saxophone. How do you interpret or how do you approach your technique on both instruments? They're both woodwind, but how do you think about your ideas playing both?
Okay, it's very complicated, but it's a good question if you have the time.
I got it.
I've got the money. No, basically, the flute is, to me, the flute is another world. It creates another, I deal in images, basically. I like to think of myself, it sounds weird, as kind of a narrative player. So I don't like to play, especially the flute, I don't like to play and just play. I like to tell some kind of story, paint a picture. So, and I utilize the flute differently. What I don't, most of the guys that play, or girls that play saxophone and flute, when they play the flute, they just transfer what they play on the saxophone to the flute, playing the same shit, but a different, sounds different, obviously. So, my idea is to not do that. My idea is to create a special world for the flute. The flute doesn't have a long jazz tradition. It's just not really a, saxophone is a classic jazz, has a jazz tradition. Flute, I decided I have to create my own tradition. So whatever I play comes from another place. It's a different, I kind of have consider myself kind of a schizophrenic. I have two dual personalities. So I try to maintain separate but equal reality. You know, Technically, it's difficult. Like when you're playing the saxophone, really, like I play fairly hard. I play hard equipment, and like when you're playing like studio work, it's not a big deal. When you're playing like, with jazz music, you pick up the flute, all of a sudden, it doesn't, it doesn't feel right. Obviously, the muscles are different. So a lot of times I cheat. Like I like talk after I play the saxophone, and I admit it. I say, well, I'm talking just to give myself a little time for the blood to come back, you know. But it's a very difficult thing to do. What I do is I shouldn't do what I do basically, but I started it and I have to finish it. So I do the best I can. The secret is, not a secret, but what I do is I practice the flute first thing, just to develop, to know where the hole is and everything, and and so I have a point of reference. So after the saxophone, I'm not totally lost. But I tell, younger players who ask me about how I deal with it. I say, first thing, don't panic. When you pick up the flute after the saxophone, it doesn't feel right, and you can't find the hole or whatever. And it's like, don't panic. Just try to relax. Try to let the air. You depend on the air to get you through, and then after a minute or so, you'll start to be cool, and get used to the idea that you're not going to sound 100% because it's just impossible. You just try to develop the strongest sound that you can get. So when you lose 20%, it's still tolerable, But if you have nothing to begin with and you lose 20%, you're finished. And then also practice like you don't, pretend you don't never have a microphone, so you can project.
Is it harder to play the flute, or is it harder to play the saxophone as far as breathing techniques?
Well, I just thought of a funny joke, but I'll answer your question first. Point is, breathing is the key. You hit on it. The good thing, like when you play the flute, it helps the saxophone because you're constantly dealing with breath. You have no reed, so it's support, diaphragm support. And so what I did, I kind of cheated. I took some flute, flute works, flute exercises. Marcel Moyes, the famous flute pedagogue. Because when I was young, I heard recordings of Don Byas. I said, man, it's impossible to play an amazing sound, get that big sound without being harsh, and the low register strong. So I said, I thought about it. So I took exercise from flute literature and started working on playing like what used to call subtone. Subtone is like, usually means playing soft, but I play a loud subtone, but uh, not much jaw pressure, all air pressure. So I started working on dee da, dee da, all the way down to the bottom. When you get to the low notes, it's really hard. You feel like you did, 500 sit-ups. So I constantly work on having enough air support. And so the flute, it's good to play the flute. It helps you with the saxophone. Saxophone destroys the flute. The flute helps the saxophone. So that's the dichotomy. But techniques are, to me, like I'm a sound person. So sound is what excites me, and I try so hard to get a really good sound on the flute. I mean, I don't. Same thing with the tenor. So if I can get my sound happening, I feel okay. I feel like I can play music. Like if sound is not happening, I'm discouraged.
When I think of the great flautists like yourself, guys like Rahsaan Roland Kirk, there was a bravado in how he played. There was like Rahsaan Roland Kirk, when he played, there was like a gusto when he played. But when you hear somebody like a James Moody or a Hubert Laws,
there's a sweetness to it.
Well, if you want to get into that, like Hubert is the best, technical flute player. He took a lot of private,
Right.
He studied with the great Julius Baker. He's a great flute player, and who I consider, as far as jazz flute, who I consider the quintessential jazz flute player was Frank West, because he had a jazz aesthetic, and he had, instrumental integrity when he played. It wasn't bullshit.
Right.
Moody was another story. He's my brother because we had the same birthday.
Wow.
And like we used to hook up on our birthdays. But Moody had a special way of, I guess you call it, articulation. So he could articulate all his bebop music on the flute, which nobody could do as well as he. He didn't get he used to ask me, he says, man, I can't get resonance. Well, resonance is another thing. He didn't have resonance, but he had amazing articulation, utilized the microphone, and he was like the best at that. So everybody has their strength and their weaknesses. And
What did you think of Herbie Mann? Because I mean, Herbie recorded these. He recorded world music. He and Yusuf Lateef kind of neck and neck because they were recording music from other worlds or other languages.
culture. Well, okay, I'm an honest person. Probably people, but Yusuf had more of instrumental integrity. He played the flute quite well. He's serious about it. Herbie was not much of a flute player. He was more of a, I don't know. He could surround himself in the right environment, and he knew how to utilize like the elements different elements. And I remember one time I was in a club and Dizzy was playing. So I was a kid, and Dizzy's introducing the bands that are coming into the club next week. I was in Philadelphia, and he said, and next week we have Herbie Mann and his Afro Jazz Ensemble. And Dizzy said, Herbie Mann, Afro. Herbie kept on repeating. But no, Herbie was very smart. He was a brilliant guy. I mean, he knew how to market, and he knew how to put himself in the right situation. He became when people thought about flute, they said Herbie Mann. But I played with him a couple of times. He's a really nice guy, but I mean, he wasn't much.
He wasn't a Yusuf, and you're right. He definitely wasn't a James Moody.
Yusuf was, he was cool. I mean, he played really well. I saw Yusuf a few years ago at the NEA thing, and I went over and I tried to talk to him. I think this has nothing to do with the flute, but I was a young guy, and I was in Philadelphia, living in Philly, and I went to Pep's, and Charles Mingus had put together a group to do Duke Ellington music. Just he had Jimmy Knepper, who was I love Jimmy Knepper. He's like a brother in a way, and Yusuf Lateef was the front line, playing Duke tunes. It's great because Yusuf is a real, what's the right word? I keep on forgetting words, but he had roots in the tradition. He could do some out shit, but his tradition was very strong, and it sounded so great. But and he did a couple of things that I heard when I was a kid that I checked out, and I went over to talk to him, but he wasn't very communicative at that point. but he was quite good. So like the flute. The thing with the flute was a novelty instrument. So if you get in there in the right time, you can create it could be famous or infamous, whatever the word might be. But there were some really good players that nobody paid attention to. But anyway, it's so the point being, like you played a tenor saxophone, you got 80 years of jazz tradition, Coleman Hawkins up, and, or whatever. So much to draw on, so much heritage to draw on, and the flute Really not that much. The basic reason is that flute is limited, you know.
It's not to cut you off. It's like the flute and the flute just doesn't. It doesn't stick out like a sax.
Well, yeah, it's got dynamic limitations, if I can come up with a phrase.
Yeah.
So you're dependent on a microphone most of the time, and so that's why it was never a major instrument. The famous flute pedagogue Marcel Moïse said, the flute is, this is the classical world, the flute is a minor instrument compared to the violin and the piano, blah, blah, blah. And in jazz, it's even a more minor instrument. So my goal was to find my voice and utilize it. What do you call it, jazz or not? I don't really give a shit. But it's whatever it is, express some feeling and make it a dynamic instrument. If it wants to be, you can make it dynamic. You can make it beautiful. You can express a lot playing the flute. Because flute, technically speaking, flute is the first instrument. People say drums are the first instrument, but someone has to bang on it. Flute happened in nature. It'd be like reeds. Reeds are growing, and the wind comes, and there's a sound. That's basically the first flute. So, flute is a special instrument. It kicks my ass, and like I have to work so hard, and to try to keep it happening and try to get better if I can. But the saxophone. If I practice the flute, saxophone, my main practice is trying to find a reed. That's my main practice, trying to find a reed, and like.
you hail from Philadelphia, and Philadelphia has always been a soulful town. I mean, you got the Brecker brothers, you got the Heath brothers, you've got Coltrane, you've got Benny Golson. What is it about that city in the trajectory of the jazz history that's made the saxophonists and composers that came out of that, like yourself, such a hard-hitting force of reckon to dealing with in the music?
Well, I don't know what I remember was Max Roach was over the house a long time ago, obviously, and he said, "Yeah, man, Philly tenor players, blah blah blah." He heard me play. So, yeah, Philly tenor players. I can always tell them, but there's a tradition in Philly. Um, it's a very complicated, interesting tradition. There's the white tradition and the black tradition, in a sense, and they were kind of like there was a separate reality, but they were really wonderful players from both sides of the fence. Everybody, all the black guys, everybody would tell you how much they taught Coltrane. I show Train this, I show Train this, I show Train. I said, sure. Well, how come you're not that great? But I mean, but it, here's another theory. I don't know if it's hold up. At least the time I grew up, to make America great again, bullshit. I was there when America was supposed to be great. It wasn't so great, and there was a lot of oppression. There was a lot of oppression in Philadelphia. There was a very right-wing reality.
Rizzo, right?
Hmm?
Was it the Mayor Rizzo, right?
Well, Mayor Rizzo, he was a devil. But before he was a mayor, he was the head of the Vice Squad. You can imagine what that was like. I mean, everybody would get beat up. Bud Powell got destroyed there. I mean, it was terrible. So there was a lot of oppression, racism, oppression. I used to get beat up too. And I didn't get beat up much, but I used to have to run away and try to, there was a lot of terrible shit happening in the 50s. Maybe it's the repression that created that energy. Maybe it's like a reaction to the environment in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is, cultural city, but there was always a backdrop of racism and discrimination, and so maybe there's something to that. I don't know. It'd have to do a lot of thought. I have to think about it. But a lot of players came out of there, and some people no one ever heard of.
Did you ever encounter Odine Pope?
Of course, yeah.
Odine is when I first started off on this, he very, very much supported me. And Odine, again, came in that class with those guys we just talked about.
Well, I saw Odine last year. Toshiko got an award, Atlantic Arts Foundation. I think it was so many of those. So I went there with her, and Odine was the previous recipient the year before. So he played with his group afterwards, and he had a really nice group. It kind of brought me back, actually. It was interesting. The rhythm section he had, and an approach reminded me. It was so funny. It reminded me of my youth, in a sense. There was a certain sound that I really miss, and it was I really enjoyed it. So, yeah, I knew Odine, and
Was there a specific technique that Philly saxophonists adhered to or tried to not emulate, but create their own language as opposed to some of the icons that you guys were listening to?
that's interesting. I don't know about that. I know, like in Chicago, there's a whole school of playing, like Griffin and all those guys, and in Memphis and all that shit. Philly, I never thought about it. The only time I even thought about it was when Max Roach mentioned it. I never think about it. I mean, there were guys I liked when I was a kid. I mean, people, they were like legendary people that no one ever heard of. They never got out of Philly, basically, usually because of drugs or whatever. But I never thought of a school of playing from. Actually, I never thought about that, and I don't. I don't know if it. I'd have to really do some research because I never paid any attention. I paid attention to the people who I really are my heroes. They weren't local people necessarily. So that's. I can't answer that question. Come back to in another year. Maybe I'll do a little research. I mean, there were some guys that no one ever heard of. There was a guy called Ziggy Vines. I think he was on 1 or 2 records. He's an amazing player, and he was totally fucked up. So I mean, he couldn't accomplish what his talent was. There were a lot of people in those right before my generation that were so, into drugs. Hey, Byrd did it, man. It's cool, it's like it was a whole school of people that thought you have to be, be a bad boy to be able to get better. Hey, man, you play good, but that kind of shit. There's a lot of pressure to not believe that bullshit. So a lot of people got ruined. But as far as this Philadelphia school, I mean, Max Roach seemed to know it better than I did.
Well, he had Odin in his band for many. He was his music director for many years.
Yeah, but I mean, there's more than Odin. I mean, Benny comes from another place.
That's right.
Benny is interesting. I didn't know these. I knew Odin a little bit. Benny, he's a generation, kind of 10 years before me or so. And his sound was like, interesting thing about him, his sound was totally unique from everybody else. He was more from the Don Bias guy. He never, he found that approach, which was quite unique. Everybody was doing, train, and he had his very personal. He stuck to it, and in fact, I owe him a phone call. I have to now that I mention him.
the train train did change the game, but as far as you playing, did he help your style, or did you have to work a little harder after Train came out?
Well, this interesting thing. I started out, I was 15 years old playing. It's not that young playing. Went through the thing. The first guy I liked was Al Cohn because all the white saxophone players idolized him. He was a great player. Then I started listening to Sonny Rollins and Coltrane, and I used to emulate Coltrane. I got pretty good at it. Then I realized that there's something wrong with this picture. Here I am, some schmuck, like standing up, pretending to be somebody else, culturally distant. And so I could get, the effect of it. But I said, there's something wrong. And so I was about 20 or 21, and I realized I have to find who am I? So I hooked up with a fellow, musician who was older than me. He had a lot of records. He was a trombone player. I remember his name. His name was Leo Fogel. And he had all these great records. And I didn't pay any attention to a lot of people. First thing he put on Prez, man, Prez. Well, that gets you, man. It's hard to not be, captured by, classic Lester. And then Ben Webster. I said, shit, man, what is that? That's beautiful.
Great lyricist.
Mm-hmm.
He could play them ballads.
And Ben Webster he's a tragedy in his sound. I'll tell you a story about that later if you're interested. But, and then Don Byas, shit, man, nobody could play the saxophone like Don Byas, like execute. Because when you have a big sound, it holds you back technically. If you notice that the guys that play faster have smaller sounds, like Sonny Stitt, even Coltrane's sound was condensed. It didn't have a big sound. And so anyway, playing all these, I said, shit, man, this is... So I started to investigate, I said, oh, Drew Berry, what about him? Hawkins, he played Hawkins. Hawkins was too hard. Hawkins, man, it was so difficult. I couldn't understand it as a young person because the sound was so different. Time was so different. The harmony was so difficult. So, in a way, he was more complicated than Byrd, in a way. So, but it opened my brain up, and I tried to listen and absorb the essence of all these great players. And then when at that point, Sonny Rollins was like my hero also, and I go to hear him, and then I figured it out. The light bulb went off. That's how he did it. I hear him play. Oh, that's Hawkins. That's Prez. Well, I hear all the little elements, and then I figured out that the way to find your style or your identity, so to speak, is you put all the influences and you put it in a pot and you mix it up, and then you come out of it. Because that's how it's done. Nobody you don't come out of nowhere. I mean, everybody comes from someplace. And so I try to explain that. Like Pepper Adams had an interesting line. He would say, if you copy from one or two players, that's plagiarism. If you copy from a lot of players, it's called research. So research is cool. And it's really important to most of the young guys, they think that sax tenor started with Train, and they might give it up a little bit to Hank Mobley, maybe, and like Brecker, Michael Brecker. So I don't know.
What did you think of Michael when he eventually came to the forefront?
Well, I knew him as a kid, because I was tight with Randy, and then he was his little brother. And Michael, I mean, he's an incredibly gifted guy, both of them. And Michael came from a different thing. Randy came from traditional reality. He loved Lee Morgan. His father was a amateur musician. Their father and listened to a lot of music So he had he comes from a traditional reality. Michael, 5 years later, came from another point, another place, and he developed what he developed. And
He was an R&B guy
whatever.
in the jazz world.
Well, he started out playing like free music, and then he found this thing, a post Coltrane thing, and he made a contribution. I mean, so, but it's kind of interesting. What were we talking about?
We were talking about the records.
Yeah, well, I would play with Randy, and his father would come. His father would come to the gig and says, "Man, I love when Randy plays with you because that's the way I like to hear him play." Because Randy can play like, we did a gig once in Dizzy's, and he played "I Can't Get Started," and it was a fucking masterpiece. It was so beautiful. He has he has the roots. He has the music inside of him. He has the history inside of him. So he can go. He enjoys everything that he does. He's lucky that he has that ability to do that. I can't do that. I'm kind of more opinionated or closed. I have my little world, and I don't need to be a pop star. But no, Randy and I play a lot. We were doing things like that. We had a group with Peter Washington and Louis Nash, Randy and myself, a long time ago. And I had such a hard time. I tried to book this gig. You have no piano. I said, what do you mean? What's the big deal? Yeah, it's not an original idea. But I had a lot of resistance. We did some gigs, we did a tour of Japan. We did some stuff. But anyway, we've been thinking about resurrecting the band, maybe to play at Lewis's club in Phoenix.
Lew Tabackin, what does jazz music mean to you?
It's interesting. It's an obvious question, but it's not. It's I don't know. I basically found my identity through jazz music, and so it's like it's the force that guides me. Basically, it's a force that propels me and keeps me going into, even though I'm at a certain demographic, I'm still working on it. And all the great jazz players that given me so much, and I really want to give something back. So jazz music is my motivating force, put it that way, if that makes any sense.
That'll do it again for another edition of the Pace Report, reporting live here at Smalls Jazz Club here in New York City. I'd like to personally thank the incomparable Lew Tabackin for his time. For more information on his upcoming club and tour dates, please visit him online at lewtabackin.com. Also, people, please come out and support Spike Wilner and Smalls Jazz Club here in New York City. They're open 7 days a week. They open at 5 o'clock. For more information as well as streaming times, directions, as well as upcoming show times, visit them online at smallslive.com. Also, people, please visit my website, thepacereport.com, for my weekly column as well as my past segments. And also like, share, and subscribe to these videos here on YouTube and Vimeo. Until next time, remember, if it's in the groove, it'll make you move. Till next time, peace.